A large tree stood on a hill, overlooking the outskirts of the city. Although substantial, it appeared smaller than an ant compared to the great elder gleam tree that towered over the entire city walls. Just outside the city walls, a boy sat beneath the tree on the hill. The boy was reading in one of the few places away from the polluted air and bog in the outskirts. He felt a signal from his old communicator and looked at it. As he did, his eyes widened. The boy stood beside a bed where his grandpa lay. On the opposite side sat his old neighbor, a kind woman who had been a long-time family friend. She'd cared for both him and his grandpa's health.
I'm sorry, Henry, but there's nothing more we can do. The best thing for him now is to let his nightmare end.
Henry slowly looked up at his neighbor and solemnly nodded. The woman then made her way out of the room, leaving only Henry and his grandpa behind. Henry stared back at the bed, before his grandpa opened his mouth.
Henry, it's good to see you. If your parents and grandmother could see you today, they would be so proud.
His grandpa's voice betrayed his ears. He was still just as soft-spoken as he remembered him as a kid, even before the accident that took both of his parents. Henry looked down at his grandpa somberly. I think it's time to tell you the full truths of the story I used to tell you when you were younger, said the grandpa. The grandfather recounted the tale of an ancient tribe that once thrived in the land before the city was built. They lived in harmony with nature, under the protection of the elder gleam trees. But when the town began to expand, the tribe was forcefully colonized, their way of life disrupted, and their sacred trees industrialized. Despite this upheaval, the tribe harbored a secret, a hidden sanctuary deep within the first elder gleam that held the history of their ancestors. The grandfather revealed that he had discovered the location of the sanctuary and its secrets, which could change the city's fate and restore balance. Henry returned to the comfortable, large roots beneath the elder gleam tree. It was a familiar place for him. He visited it during times of happiness, stress, anger, and today, grief. The tree that had silently witnessed the cycles of life and death many times, and once again today. Now a young man, Henry stood alone by the tree, holding a small, weathered journal, the last gift from his grandfather. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind as he gazed at the horizon. The sanctuary beneath the elder gleam tree, hidden history, the truth buried beneath the city. He hadn't known what to say then, but now, alone beneath the branches, he felt the weight of those words settling into something heavier than grief. The city of walls stood in the distance, its presence unshakable, its towers gleaming cold under the polluted sky. He had never questioned the world before, but now there were questions he could not ignore. He ran his fingers over the journal's cracked leather cover, and with a steadying breath, opened it. The first page was filled with his grandfather's cramped handwriting, hurried, detailed, pressing. Some words were underlined, others scribbled over in frustration. Maps, notes, fragmented sentences that hinted at something larger. And there, at the very bottom of the page, scrawled in uneven ink, "Find the roots beneath the city. They buried the past, but the trees will never forget." Henry's breath hitched. But what did it mean? What was he supposed to do with this? His fingers hovered over the ink, as if the answer would surface if he just stared long enough. But no revelation came. No understanding settled in his chest. He sighed, shutting the journal softly and pressing it against his knee. He had no plan, no direction, only this book and the strange, unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. For the first time, doubt curled in his stomach, heavier than grief. He didn't know what to do. The next morning, Henry woke to the distant hum of machinery, the rhythmic churn of the air purifiers groaning in the distance. The outskirts never knew silence, now with the city looming over them, its mechanisms running endlessly above their heads. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face before his fingers found the journal again. It was still there, still real. A part of him had half expected it to be gone, as if it were nothing more than a fevered dream brought on by grief. But its weight in his hands was solid, undeniable. He turned it over, flipping through pages without really seeing them. Maybe there was something here, some obvious answer waited in the ink. But if there was, he wasn't ready to find it. With a sigh, he tucked the journal back into his coat. He had a shift today. If nothing else, that would keep his mind occupied. The outskirts were waking as Henry walked through the muddy streets, his boots sinking into the damp ground. The settlement was a patchwork of makeshift homes, rusted metal, and scraps of old infrastructure the city had long abandoned. People moved between narrow alleys, some heading toward the few markets that still functioned, others already waiting in line at the water stations, their expressions weary. This was normal. Life went on, even after his loss. Henry stopped at a vendor's stall, exchanging a few crumpled credits for a piece of dried ration bread. He wasn't hungry, but eating gave him something to do. The woman behind the stall, an older lady wrapped in layers of faded cloth, studied him as she handed over the bread. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said after a pause. Henry didn't reply. He just nodded, tucking the food into his coat and moving on. His workplace was one of recycling centers stationed on the outskirts, where scrap metal and discarded tech from the inner rings were sorted, stripped, and repurposed. It was exhausting, dull work, but it paid. Barely. Henry arrived at the warehouse, stepping into the dimly lit interior, where workers were already busy dismantling rusted panels and sorting wiring. He clocked in, pulled on a pair of gloves, and made his way to his usual station. Hours passed. The repetitive nature of the work dulled his thoughts and gave him space to exist without overthinking. He was halfway through stripping insulation from a bundle of cables when he heard raised voices near the entrance. Curious, he straightened, glancing over his shoulder. A group of city enforcers had entered the warehouse, their stark uniforms a sharp contrast against the grime of the workplace. Enforcers never came here. There was nothing worth their time on the outskirts, and yet they were scanning the warehouse with cold, assessing eyes. Henry turned back to his work, keeping his head down. He had no reason to be on their radar, but caution was second nature on the outskirts. You didn't invite trouble. You ignored it, hoped it passed you by. Then one of the enforcers spoke. "We're looking for someone, an old man, last seen in this sector." Henry's hands froze. "Anyone seen him?" the enforcer continued, holding up a grainy, hollow image. The quality was poor, but the face was unmistakable. His grandfather. A knot tightened in Henry's stomach. His grandfather was dead. What did they want with him now? No one answered. The workers had gone quiet, their unease thick in the air. After a moment, the lead enforcer scoffed, lowering the hollow image. "If anyone remembers anything, report it to the station. We'll be watching." With that, they turned and left, leaving behind a heavy silence. Henry forced himself to keep working, but his hands were unsteady. His grandfather had been dead for days. Why were the enforcers looking for him now? It wasn't grief curling in his stomach anymore. It was fear and confusion. That night, unable to shake the feeling of unease, Henry returned to his small quarters and retrieved the journal once more. The enforcer's visit had unsettled him. He didn't know why they were looking for his grandpa. He sat at the small table in his cramped living space, the dim glow of an overhead light casting long shadows on the pages. He skimmed through his grandfather's notes, his mind sluggish from the weight of the day. His fingers traced the familiar, hurried script. The past hasn't gone, they only buried it. Buried it where? His grandfather had been obsessed with the past. Henry had always dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man who refused to move on. But now, after the enforcers, after their questions, Henry wasn't sure anymore. He turned the page, then another. His tired eyes scanned words, annotations, and sketches. Most of it still didn't make sense. References to places Henry had never heard of, names that held no meaning. A sigh left him and he leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "I don't know what I'm looking for." His gaze drifted back to the journal, to the old ink and creased pages. He almost shut it, almost let exhaustion win. But then his eyes caught something small. A series of numbers written over and over again. They weren't coordinates, not exactly, but they looked like locations. Henry frowned and flipped back to the journal, searching for any mention of the numbers. He found them scribbled in margins, circled in old ink, paired with short, cryptic phrases. And then, finally, he found something different. A rough, hand-drawn map, the same numbers scrawled at the bottom. His breath slowed. It wasn't a map of the city as it is now. It was older and outdated, and one place was marked more than the others. A ventilation station. Henry stared at it, a knot forming in his chest. He had seen that place before, one of the abandoned systems near the city's border. It had been shut down for years, left to rot like everything else the city deemed unnecessary. But his grandfather had circled it multiple times. Henry closed the journal carefully, his fingers tight over the cover. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew where to start. The next evening, after his shift, Henry made his way toward the outskirts of the city's lower ring. He moved carefully, keeping his hood up and his posture casual. Even in the dim light of dusk, the city's presence loomed heavy over the streets. The further he walked from the main roads, the quieter it became. The ventilation station wasn't far, but it was isolated. People avoided places like this. Abandoned structures were seen as dangerous, unstable, and sometimes even cursed. No one had reason to go near them, which meant if someone was watching, he'd stand out. He slipped through the rusted fence that barely held itself upright, his boots crunching against dry debris. The entrance to the station was locked, as expected, but years of neglect had left the door hinges weak. A few sharp tugs, and it groaned open just enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, dust hung thick in the air, undisturbed. The place smelled of rust and decay, the scent of stagnant metal long since abandoned. Pipes stretched across the ceiling like skeletal remains, and a broken control panel flickered weakly, its screen long cracked. Henry pulled out his flashlight and traced it over the walls. At first glance, there was nothing unusual, just another forgotten ruin of the city's past. But then he saw them. Fingerprints in the dust, fresh. His pulse quickened. Someone had been in here recently. Swallowing, he moved deeper into the station, his footsteps careful now. The footprints led toward an old storage section, where heavy metal crates had been stocked long ago. Henry followed them until he stopped near a grated floor panel. His brow furrowed. The panel looked loose, its edges slightly lifted. Crouching, he wedged his fingers beneath it and pulled. With a groan, the panel lifted, revealing a narrow space beneath. Something was hidden inside, a small metallic emblem, worn with age. Henry hesitated before reaching for it. The metal was cold against his skin, the engraving on its surface almost rubbed away by time. He traced the faint etchings with his thumb, recognizing a symbol he had never seen before. It looked like the outline of a tree, but distorted, its roots tangled into a design he couldn't quite understand. His stomach tightened. His grandfather had never mentioned this. Why had it been hidden here? Turning it over, he noticed something else. Small, finely inscribed text along the edge of the emblem. The lettering was elegant and deliberate. Kale Industries. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Kale? He didn't know the name, but something about it felt important. The knot in his chest tightened. Whatever this was, whatever this emblem meant, it was connected to something far bigger than an old ventilation station, and he needed to find out what. The next morning, Henry sat at his workbench, the emblem resting on the wooden surface before him. It gleamed faintly under the dim light, the engraved name staring back at him like a challenge. He had spent the night turning it over in his hands, running his fingers over its worn edges, trying to recall if he had ever heard of Kale Industries. The name was unfamiliar, yet something about it lingered, like a half-remembered whisper. His fingers drummed against the table. If he wanted answers, he needed information. But information wasn't easy to come by on the outskirts. He knew where to start, though. There was a market on the edge of the second ring, a place where traders, smugglers, and scrap dealers passed through. If anyone knew about old industry names, it'd be someone there. Pulling his coat on, Henry tucked the emblem into his pocket and stepped outside. The streets were already filling with the morning rush, people moving between stalls and vendors, bartering for food and supplies. The air was thick with the scent of metal and damp earth, the ever-present hum of the city vibrating beneath his feet. The market was noisy, alive with the chatter of merchants and the occasional shout of a deal gone wrong. Henry moved with the crowd, scanning faces, searching for someone who might have the answers he needed. And then he spotted him, a trader hunched over a table of old machine parts and discarded tech, his hands blackened with grease. Henry approached cautiously. "I'm looking for something," he said, keeping his voice even. "A name." The trader didn't look up.
"A name's gonna cost you."
Henry pulled out a few credits and placed them on the table. The trader smirked, pocketing them before leaning back.
All right, kid. What name?
Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out the emblem, setting it down on the table between them. "Kale Industries. What do you know about it?" The trader's smirk faded instantly. His fingers twitched toward the emblem, but he stopped short, his gaze darkening.
Where'd you get this?
He asked, his voice suddenly cautious. Henry's pulse quickened. That was the reaction of a man who knew something. "Does it matter?" Henry countered. The trader exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face.
You don't want to be asking about that name, kid. Not unless you want trouble.
Henry met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Maybe I do." The trader's eyes darted around the market, checking to see if anyone was listening. His fingers twitched near the emblem again, but he didn't touch it. Henry could see the shift in his demeanor. What started as amusement had turned into wariness. Henry leaned forward slightly. "You know something." The trader exhaled sharply and shook his head.
I know enough to tell you leave it alone. Kale Industries? That name hasn't been spoken in years. Not unless you got a death wish.
Henry's stomach twisted. Why? What happened to them? The trader hesitated before lowering his voice.
They didn't disappear. Not really. They just changed.
Henry's pulse quickened. Changed how? The trader let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it.
They rebranded, moved into the shadows. Nowadays, they run that flower paint business in the second ring. Pretty little storefront with bright petals and synthetic dye. But that's just the face that they show the city.
Henry's brow furrowed. What are they hiding?
Everything.
The trader said darkly.
They control half the city's contracts, utility rights, and transit records. But flower shops just a front. The Kell family never went away. They just got better at staying hidden. They're the ones really pulling the strings.
Henry's grip tightened around the emblem in his pocket. He had known from the moment he found it that it meant something, but he hadn't realized just how deep this went. He glanced around the market. No one was paying attention to them, not yet. "Just tell me one thing," he said. "Why hasn't anyone exposed them?" The trader sighed, rubbing a hand over his face before finally answering.
Because anyone who tries disappears. The family has people in every layer of the city. Government, enforcement, media, even memory. People don't talk about them because they've been trained not to.
Henry's throat was dry. He thought of the ventilation station, of his grandfather's notes, of the enforcers looking for him even after he was dead. The trader's expression hardened.
I'm telling you to walk away while you still can.
Henry stood there for a moment, weighing his options. He could leave, pretend none of this mattered, but he had already come too far. His grandfather had left this behind for him to find. He knew that now, so he made his choice. "Thanks for the warning," Henry said, turning to leave. The trader called after him. "All right."
Kid, don't be stupid. You poke a ghost and they'll come knocking.
Henry didn't stop walking. That night, he returned home with the emblem in hand, the trader's warning still echoing in his mind. He set the metal piece on the table and stared at it, chewing the inside of his cheek. There had to be something more. The city didn't just ignore the Kell family, it let them vanish into plain sight. Henry reached for the journal again, flipping through the pages not for symbols this time, but for names. And slowly, as if the pieces had always been there waiting to be seen, a few began to click together. A name scratched into the margin near one of the city's water management plants. A half-torn page with a list of surnames and institutions, one of which had been crossed out violently. Kell. It appeared again, not as a title, but a signature. Faint, old, partially faded. He grabbed a fresh sheet of paper and began jotting down everything he found connected to the name. Locations, phrases, places. Patterns began to form. The family wasn't a memory. They were a shadow, stretching over every sector. Tied to infrastructure, old utilities, essential systems still used by the city, even if the public no longer knew who built them. And if those systems were still functioning, there might be records. But he couldn't access them from the outskirts, not legally. He would need to find a way inside, not just into the city, into his core. 2 days later, Henry stood at the edge of a cargo terminal near the inner border of Ring 3, eyes fixed on the checkpoint gate. Massive freight containers rolled through on automated rails, guarded loosely by board workers and low-level security drones. It wasn't a military outpost, it was a logistics center. And logistics meant movement, gaps, opportunities. He had watched the rotation for hours, memorizing the intervals. There was a 10-minute window between 2 shift changes and a blind spot behind a stack of old containers. He took a breath and stepped forward. Sneaking into the city wasn't just dangerous, it was treason. But if he wanted to find anything that mattered, old records, mentions of Kell, maybe even a connection to his grandfather's story, this was the only path. He slipped into the blind spot as a cargo tram hissed by, its massive wheels masking his footsteps. He crouched low, waited, then moved fast, darting into the shadow of a delivery truck, then under it. He clung to the underside with makeshift magnetic gloves he had salvaged from work. It wasn't comfortable, but it was working. The truck passed the checkpoint slowly. The buzz of a scanner hummed just inches above him, but didn't pause. And then they were through. Henry didn't breathe until the truck rattled down a ramp into the wide open of Ring 3. He rolled out into a service alley and darted behind a recycling unit. He was in. The first thing he noticed was the smell, not of rot or chemicals like the outskirts, but clean metal and artificial bloom. The second ring was near enough now that the scent of synthetic flowers hung faintly in the air. And in the distance, tucked between rows of administrative towers and storefronts, the Kell flower shop. It looked harmless, but he knew better now, and he was going to find out what it was really hiding. Henry watched the shop from the upper level of an automated tram station across the street. The flower shop pulsed with quiet life, its display windows aglow with soft pink and gold lighting, vines curling artistically around the entrance. Customers came and went without pause, unaware of anything beyond the surface. He kept to the shadows, noting employee shifts, delivery times, and the shop's back entrances. A pair of workers in green aprons chatted idly by the loading dock, unaware they were being observed. For 3 days he took notes. He saw the same black delivery van come and go at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. It never stayed long. What caught his eye was that no products ever seemed to go in or out. The van entered the private lot and left minutes later, always with the same driver, always unmarked cargo. And once, just once, he saw her. She stepped out of the side door like she'd done 1,000 times, graceful, purposeful. Her dark coat swayed as she crossed the garden path, a clipboard in hand. She was speaking with someone briefly before vanishing into the back hallway. Henry hadn't known her name then, but he remembered the emblem on her coat. Faint, silver, and unmistakably the same symbol he had found beneath the ventilation station. He didn't follow her, not yet. Instead, he leaned deeper into the shadows and scribbled a name into his notebook. If she was connected to Cale, he needed to know who she was, and how close she stood to the truth he was chasing. It happened on the 4th evening. Henry was making his way back from the tram station when he heard the commotion, a sharp voice calling out, the unmistakable thud of boots chasing someone through the lower alleys. Then she collided with him. A blur of motion and fabric slammed into his side, and he staggered back, catching the weight instinctively. Her hood had fallen, revealing windswept hair, flushed cheeks, and wide, terrified eyes. Behind her, 2 security officers turned the corner. Henry's brain barely had a second to catch up. "This way," he hissed, grabbing her arm. They slipped into a service hatch nestled between 2 towering walls of exhaust vents, vanishing into steam and shadow. The door shut with a whisper, and the alley fell silent. The girl gasped for breath, her hand clutched tightly around a worn satchel. She looked at Henry with a mix of confusion and fear, ready to bolt again.
You're not one of them,
She said softly, more realization than question. "Neither are you," Henry replied. Her eyes darted to the satchel as if realizing she was still holding it. He could tell whatever was inside mattered, a lot. The silence stretched until Henry broke it. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but I know a place we can go. Somewhere quiet." She hesitated, then nodded. They moved quickly and quietly through the alleys, guided by instinct and a shared unease neither could name. Henry led her through the maintenance tunnels beneath the tram lines, down rusted stairs thick with condensation, until the sounds of the upper city faded into a distant hum. When they reached the abandoned utility chamber he had scouted days before, Henry slipped inside first, checked for movement, and gestured her in. "It's not much," he said, "but no one comes here." She didn't speak for a long moment, her breathing slowing as she lowered herself onto an overturned crate. The bag remained clenched in her lap. Henry watched her from across the room. "You said I'm not one of them." She nodded. "I'm guessing you aren't either." Another pause, then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper.
My name is Althea.
Henry straightened. The name clicked into place. Cale. She saw the change in his expression.
You've heard it?
He nodded slowly, the weight of everything he'd uncovered pressing down all at once. Althea looked away, her eyes clouded.
Then you know what they are, what my family is.
Henry sat down opposite her, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know enough to be afraid of them, but I don't know why they're trying to bury the past. I don't know what they're still hiding." Althea hesitated, then opened the bag slowly. She pulled out a thin photo album, its corners frayed with age. She didn't hand it to him, just let him see.
My grandpa told me stories about before the city had walls, before people like him were erased. I thought it was just the kind of thing old people say when they're tired. But now, I don't know them.
Henry looked at the album, then back at her. "My grandfather said something similar. He left me a journal filled with notes and maps, about roots buried under the city, about the elder gleam trees, about Cale." The silence between them grew heavier, but less hostile.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all of it. I'm not like them, but I'm still part of it.
"Maybe that's why it matters," Henry said. "Because you're not like them. Because you're in a position to see what they've done." Althea met his eyes.
And you? Why are you doing this?
Henry was quiet for a long moment. "Because my grandfather died trying to protect something, and I'm starting to think it was the truth, about what the city really is." She nodded, slowly.
Then maybe, we're after the same thing.
The overhead light flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the sounds of the city returned to their usual dull hum. Henry reached into his coat and pulled out the worn emblem. He placed it between them on the floor. "Then let's find it, together." Althea looked at the emblem, then back at him, and for the first time since they had met, she didn't look like she was about to run.